It was a Saturday afternoon like any other. The sun was barely setting, casting a warm glow over the neighborhood, and I was driving with no real destination in mind. The idea to visit my parents' house popped into my head suddenly, almost like a memory that had been tucked away in the back of my mind, waiting for the right moment to resurface. I hadn't seen them in a while, and despite everything that had been going on in my life, something in me longed for that familiar sense of home. Maybe it was nostalgia. Or maybe I just wanted to feel connected to something real, for once. The house looked the same as always when I pulled into the driveway. My mom's garden was in full bloom, the flowers vibrant with colors that seemed to match her cheerful personality. I didn't even hesitate as I got out of the car. I figured I would surprise them, let them know I was still around. I always enjoyed those moments when I could pop in unannounced and catch them off guard. It had been too long since I had shared a simple moment with them without the heaviness of life clouding the atmosphere. As I walked toward the front door, I could hear voices coming from inside. My parents were talking, but not in the usual lighthearted way. The tone was tense, almost as if they were discussing something serious, maybe even uncomfortable. I paused, not wanting to intrude, but curious enough to listen. There was something about the way their voices sounded that made me stay rooted in place. I leaned closer to the window, straining to catch a few words. The conversation seemed casual at first, just my mom and dad chatting about daily life. But then, something she said hit me like a punch to the gut. Don't even think about telling him. You want him broke, moving back here, drinking all day. No way. You're not ruining their family over her tiny mistake. The shock hit instantly, as though my body had frozen in place. The words hung in the air and I couldn't move. I didn't even know what she was talking about, but the implication was clear. She had made a mistake, and it was somehow significant enough to change everything. My heart began to race, and I tried to steady my breathing. Was this about my wife? What mistake could she be referring to? I didn't know how much more I could handle. The tension in my chest grew tighter with every passing second. I wanted to turn around and walk away. I didn't want to hear any more. But it was too late. My dad responded, his voice low and heavy, carrying an undeniable weight of bitterness. He's living his life, not knowing he's raising kids that aren't his. The world around me seemed to fall silent for a moment. His words echoed in my head, reverberating like a deafening roar. I felt like I had been struck by something sharp and unyielding. My hands trembled as I gripped the windowsill, trying to make sense of what I had just heard. Kids that weren't mine. What did that even mean? I hadn't heard anything about an affair. Sure, my wife had been distant lately, and there had been whispers, but nothing had prepared me for this. What if he was talking about my own children? It didn't seem possible, but the doubt started creeping in like a shadow I couldn't escape. I stayed rooted to the spot, almost afraid to breathe, afraid that any sound I made might give me away. But I had to hear the rest. I had to understand what was happening, even though I knew deep down that I might regret it. The silence between their voices seemed to stretch for an eternity, and then my mom spoke again, her voice colder now, more resolute. So what? He loves them, and they're happy. Let him be a good dad. Her words, so matter-of-fact, hit me harder than anything else she had said. So what? It was as if she had dismissed my entire existence, my role as a father, as if it didn't matter. All this time I had been loving and caring for children who might not even be mine, and she was brushing it off like it was no big deal. My heart felt heavy in my chest, like it was too full of emotion to process in a single moment. I wanted to scream, to burst through that door and demand answers, but I stayed silent, too stunned to act. My dad's response came almost immediately, his voice filled with an odd mixture of resignation and anger. He deserves to know the truth, but your pride is more important. I felt like I was suffocating in that moment, my entire world crumbling beneath me. The words, the truth, burned into my mind like a brand. I wanted to run away, to escape, but I couldn't. I was stuck in this nightmare, listening to the people who were supposed to be my support system betray me in ways I never imagined possible. I knew in that instant that I couldn't stay there any longer. I couldn't face them, not after hearing this. They had lied to me, and worse, they had protected my wife's secret. The thought of continuing with this facade was unbearable. It was clear that my parents, the people I had trusted the most, had chosen to keep me in the dark. They'd chosen to allow me to live in a lie for their own convenience. I didn't know what I was supposed to do. How could I just walk away from this? My whole life, my entire perception of what I thought was real, had been shattered by a conversation I wasn't meant to hear. But I couldn't go back to the way things were. The trust I once had was gone, and it seemed there was no going back. Without another word, I turned and walked back to my car. The drive home felt like an eternity. My mind raced, processing everything, trying to make sense of it all. I had to confront my wife, but I wasn't ready. I wasn't ready to face the truth. The truth I had just uncovered felt like it was too much to bear. How could I have been so blind? How had I missed the sign? The drive back home felt like a blur. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles ached, but I barely noticed. My mind was racing, heart pounding in my chest, every thought spiraling in a dizzying loop. The conversation I had overheard kept playing in my head over and over again. My parents knew. My dad knew. And what struck me the hardest was the casual way my mom had spoken about it, almost as though this was something normal. To what she had said, dismissing everything I had believed in. She didn't care about the truth. She didn't care that I had been living a lie for years. All that mattered to her was that I didn't find out. The kids were happy, and that was enough for her. I could barely process it. My entire life up until this point felt like it had been a series of lies, carefully constructed by the people I trusted most. How had I been so naive? How had I not seen the cracks in the facade? I kept thinking about the things I had missed, the strange behavior from my wife, the subtle hints that now seemed so obvious. But no, I hadn't been suspicious enough. I hadn't even considered the possibility that my entire world was built on something fake, something constructed by the very people I relied on. The thoughts kept coming faster and faster. The idea that my kids weren't mine tore through me like a thunderclap. How could I even begin to understand this? How could I look at my children, the ones I had raised and loved as my own, and know that they might not share my blood? My chest tightened at the thought. The mere possibility sent waves of panic through me. I had been a father to them, a real father, in every sense that mattered. But now, nothing felt real. How had this happened? How had I been so blind I had given them everything? My time, my energy, my love. And in return, they had given me a lie. I couldn't bring myself to go home, not yet. My mind was in turmoil, and my body was physically drained from the shock of everything I had just learned. I drove aimlessly, the city lights blurring past me in the darkness. I didn't know where I was going, but I didn't want to go back to that house, to that life. Not yet. I kept thinking about my parents, my mom especially, the way she had coldly dismissed everything, my marriage, my children, my sense of identity. It felt like I had been nothing more than a pawn in their game, something they could manipulate to avoid dealing with the truth. She didn't even care enough to tell me the truth herself, to give me the chance to make my own decisions, to face what had been done. No, she had decided for me. She had decided to protect my wife, to shield her from the consequences of her actions, even if it meant betraying me. I didn't know which hurt more, the fact that my wife had betrayed me, or that my own mother had protected her lie. I thought about confronting my wife right then, about confronting her with the truth, but I didn't know if I could. How could I face her? How could I look into her eyes knowing what she had done? I had to admit, even to myself, that I had seen the signs. There had been moments, little moments, when something seemed off, but I had brushed them aside. I had trusted her completely. Even when the whispers started, the way she would get defensive when I asked simple questions about her day, the late nights, the random trips that didn't add up. I had ignored it, believing in the marriage we had built together. I didn't know if I could ever trust her again. The thought of confronting her felt like a weight that was too heavy to bear. But how could I keep living with this uncertainty? How could I continue pretending that everything was fine when I knew it wasn't? How could I even look at her and pretend that nothing had changed when the foundation of everything we had built was based on a lie? The silence in the car was suffocating, and I felt completely alone. There was no one I could talk to. My parents, who I had turned to for support throughout my life, been the ones to keep this from me. They had known, and then they had allowed me to live in the dark. I didn't have a single person I could trust right now. I was entirely on my own, and I didn't know how to navigate this. I pulled over into a quiet parking lot, the lights from nearby stores reflecting off the windshield. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring into the dark, trying to make sense of it all. The idea of a DNA test had crossed my mind, but I quickly pushed it aside. I was afraid of what I would find, of what the truth might reveal. But at the same time, I knew I couldn't live in limbo. I couldn't continue with the doubt gnawing at me, consuming me from the inside out. I had to know, even if it broke me. The truth would hurt, but it would also free me from this prison of uncertainty. Eventually, I knew what I had to do. I couldn't keep running from it. I had to go home, face my wife, and confront the truth. But as I turned the car around and drove back to the house, I felt a sense of dread settle in my stomach. The life I had known, the life I had worked so hard to build, was gone. There was no going back to the way things were. I wasn't sure what I would find when I walked through that door, but I knew that everything had changed. Nothing would ever be the same again. I just didn't know how I was going to live with it. The days that followed felt like a blur. I couldn't focus on anything, my mind constantly drifting back to that conversation I had overheard at my parents' house. The weight of what I had learned about my wife, my kids, and the lies that had been building up for years kept pressing down on me, like an invisible force I couldn't escape. I didn't know what to do, where to go, or how to even start processing all of it. The world around me felt completely different, like the ground beneath my feet had been pulled away, leaving me standing in a void. I tried to keep up with my daily routine, forcing myself to go through the motions of work, eating, and sleeping, but nothing felt real anymore. Everything I had built my life around seemed to have been turned upside down. The one constant in my life had been my family. I thought I understood them, thought I knew them, but the truth had shattered that understanding in an instant. My wife, the woman I had trusted with everything, had betrayed me. My parents, the people I had turned to for support, had kept the secret from me, protected her, and allowed me to continue living in blissful ignorance. The hardest part was the kids. How could I face them, knowing that they might not be mine? I had raised them, loved them, and thought of them as my own. They were a part of me in every way that mattered, but now I couldn't help but wonder if everything had been a lie. The idea that they weren't mine biologically was something I couldn't even begin to wrap my head around, but despite the doubts, I couldn't stop loving them. They didn't deserve any of this, and I didn't want them to suffer because of the mistakes of the adults around them. I spent hours, days, lost in my thoughts. The uncertainty gnawed at me, constantly reminding me that I was living in a fog of betrayal. I knew I needed to confront my wife. I needed answers, even if those answers hurt. But I wasn't ready. I couldn't bring myself to face her. Not yet. How could I? The thought of confronting her, of asking her the questions I had been avoiding, felt like an insurmountable task. She had already betrayed me in the worst way possible. What would I do if I found out the truth? I told myself I needed time, that I couldn't just rush into anything. But as the days stretched into weeks, I started to realize that I was only delaying the inevitable. The truth was hanging over me, suffocating me, and I couldn't keep avoiding it. I had to find out whether the children I loved and cared for were truly mine. I had to know if the woman I had shared my life with had been lying to me for all these years. The urge to get a DNA test grew stronger with every passing day, but I was terrified. What if the results shattered everything? What if the children I had cared for so deeply weren't mine at all? I wasn't sure how I would handle that. I wasn't sure how I would ever look at them the same way again. But then again, what choice did I have? I couldn't live with this constant doubt. I had to know. One night, after an especially long day of trying to ignore the storm brewing inside me, I finally made the decision. I would get the test. I would find out the truth no matter how painful it might be. As soon as the thought crossed my mind, something inside me clicked. I knew that this was the only way forward. I couldn't keep living in the dark, couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. I called the clinic the next morning, arranging the appointment. The waiting period that followed felt like an eternity. Every moment was filled with anxiety, the uncertainty of what I would learn gnawing at my insides. I kept picturing the faces of my children, wondering if they were truly mine. I tried to push the thoughts aside, but they lingered, relentless in their pursuit. During this time, I distanced myself from my wife. I couldn't bring myself to speak to her about the things that were weighing on me. I couldn't look her in the eye without feeling the sting of betrayal. She had been so distant recently, but I hadn't fully understood why until now. Her actions, her avoidance, her secrecy, everything began to make sense in a way that was too painful to accept. I had seen the signs, had felt the shift in our relationship, but I had chosen to ignore it, to believe that everything would be okay. Now it was too late. The day of the test came and I couldn't stop shaking as I sat in the waiting room. Every second felt like a countdown to a life-altering revelation. The technician took the samples, and as soon as I walked out of the clinic, I felt a wave of both relief and dread. The truth was out there now, and it was only a matter of time before I knew what it was. As the days passed, I found myself spiraling deeper into a pit of despair. I couldn't focus on anything except the test results. What if I wasn't their father? What if everything I had done, all the years I had spent raising them, were based on a lie? The idea of losing them, of losing the only family I had ever known, seemed unbearable. Yet, I also knew that I couldn't keep living with this uncertainty. When the results finally arrived, I sat alone in my apartment, staring at the envelope in my hands. I knew that opening it would change everything. I couldn't decide whether I wanted to know the truth or not, but I opened it anyway. The results confirmed what I had feared. 2 of my 3 children were not biologically mine. The pain of that moment was like nothing I had ever experienced. My stomach turned and my heart shattered into a million pieces. The children I had loved as my own, the ones I had raised, were not mine by blood. The devastation was overwhelming, and for the first time in a long while, I couldn't breathe. But even as the pain consumed me, there was a part of me that refused to let go. They were still my children, no matter what the test said. I had raised them, cared for them, and loved them with everything I had. That didn't change, even if the biology did. They were mine in every way that truly mattered. Now the real question was, what would I do next? The days after receiving the DNA results felt like I was stuck in a strange limbo, suspended between 2 lives, neither of which felt like mine anymore. I wasn't sure how to move forward, how to navigate this world where everything I had known was suddenly uncertain. The kids, whom I had raised, loved, and thought of as my own, weren't mine biologically, and that fact alone shook me to my core. The betrayal that had been hiding in plain sight for so long was finally laid bare, and now I was left to pick up the pieces of a life that had been built on a lie. I had already known, deep down, that I would never be able to look at my wife the same way again. The trust had been shattered, and with it, every assumption I had made about our marriage, about our family, came crumbling down. But still, the weight of it all, the reality of what had happened, of what she had done, felt unbearable. It was hard to accept that someone I had shared my life with, someone I had trusted above all else, had betrayed me so completely. The reality so far down the road that I'd walked had mirrored us all, our actions and our words. No one knew what to expect. What was worse was the fact that I had been living in a constant state of ignorance, happily believing that my family was intact, that everything was fine, when in reality it was all falling apart. I couldn't stop thinking about my wife, about the years we had spent together. Had I really known her at all? The woman I had built a life with, who had been by my side through thick and thin, had deceived me in the most intimate way possible. How could I have missed the signs? How could I have been so blind? But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that the signs had been there all along. The late nights, the unexplained absences, the distant conversations, and yet I had chosen to ignore them. I had trusted her completely because I wanted to believe that everything was as it seemed. The thought of confronting her was a constant weight on my mind. Part of me wanted to scream, to confront her with the truth and demand an explanation. But another part of me was scared. Scared of what I would find, scared of what her reaction would be, and most of all, scared of the emotional toll it would take on me. I didn't know how to even start that conversation. I didn't know how to ask her the questions I had been avoiding. The whole thing felt too overwhelming, and yet I knew that I couldn't go on like this forever. I had to face the truth, even if it hurt. But I also had the kids to think about. How would I explain this to them? How could I possibly tell them that the father they had known all their lives might not actually be their father? The thought of breaking their hearts, of taking away the only stability they had known, was unbearable. They had no idea what had been happening behind the scenes, and I wanted to protect them from the pain that was now threatening to unravel everything. They were innocent in all of this, and I didn't want to be the one to destroy their world. I found myself constantly questioning my role in all of this. Was I just a pawn in some twisted game, kept in the dark while everyone else made decisions for me? Or had I played a part in my own misery, turning a blind eye to the cracks in my relationship, to the signs that something wasn't right? It was hard to reconcile the person I thought I knew with the reality that was now unfolding before me. The man I had been trusting, loving, naive, seemed like a stranger to me now. In the midst of all this, I had to make a choice. I had to decide what kind of future I wanted for myself, for my children, for my family. The road ahead felt uncertain, and every step I took felt like I was walking into a fog, unsure of what lay ahead. But one thing was clear: I could no longer continue down the path I had been on. Something had to change. I couldn't go back to pretending, to living in a world where lies were the foundation of everything I held dear. It wasn't just about my wife's betrayal anymore, it was about my own identity, my own sense of self. I had spent years building a life around a lie, and now I had to figure out who I was without that lie. Was I still the same person I had been before I knew the truth? Could I still be the father I wanted to be, even if the kids weren't biologically mine? Could I even stay married to a woman who had betrayed me so completely? The questions felt endless, and there were no easy answers. I started to pull away from my wife, not because I wanted to, but because I couldn't bear to be close to her anymore. Every time I looked at her, I saw the woman who had deceived me. I saw the lies in her eyes, the betrayal in her smile, and it made my stomach turn. I didn't know how to fix this, how to go back to the way things were, because I knew deep down that there was no going back. The trust had been broken, and once something like that is shattered, it's nearly impossible to repair. At the same time, I couldn't ignore the fact that I still had feelings for her. Despite everything that had happened, despite everything she had done, there was a part of me that still loved her. It was painful to admit, but it was true, and that made everything even more complicated. How could I love someone who had hurt me so deeply? How could I reconcile the love I still felt for her with the anger and betrayal that now consumed me? I spent days thinking about what to do next. The pain of betrayal was heavy, and it was hard to imagine moving forward with any sense of peace. But I knew I couldn't keep living in this emotional turmoil. I had to make a decision, even if that decision meant walking away from everything I had ever known. It felt like I was standing at a crossroads, and no matter which path I chose, my life would never be the same again. I couldn't help but wonder what the future held for me. Would I ever be able to trust anyone again? Would I ever be able to rebuild my life from the rubble of what had been? And most importantly, would I be able to find peace, whether that meant staying with my wife or walking away? Only time would tell. But for now, I had to take the first step. Whatever came next, I had to face it head on. 5 years had passed since I walked away from my family, since I made the decision to cut off all ties with them. I had left without looking back, not because I didn't love them, but because I couldn't bear to stay in a place where everything felt like a lie. The truth, once revealed, had taken everything from me, the sense of trust, the foundation of my marriage, and the certainty I had about who I was. I couldn't continue pretending, couldn't continue living in a world that no longer made sense, so I left, not knowing what my future would hold, but certain that I couldn't stay in the past. During those 5 years, I learned how to survive without the family I had once held so dearly. I built a new life for myself, piece by piece, in the quiet corners of the world where no one knew my story. I tried to move forward, tried to heal, but there was always something missing. The memories of my children, the echoes of laughter in a house that used to be full of life, haunted me. I tried to convince myself that I was better off without them, that cutting them out of my life was the only way to move on. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape the feeling that something, someone, was always missing. I had heard nothing from my parents during those years. After the way they had shielded my wife's betrayal, after they had chosen to keep me in the dark, I couldn't bring myself to reach out to them. They had made their choices, and I had made mine. But even though I stayed away, there were times when I couldn't help but wonder about them, what they were doing, how they were living, whether they missed me the way I missed them. I never reached out, though. I couldn't. The wounds were still too raw, and I was still too angry. One day, as I was going about my routine, the phone rang. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, but something in my gut told me to pick up. It was my mother's voice on the other end. She sounded as though she had been crying, her words coming in quick, shaky bursts. My heart skipped a beat, and for a moment I didn't know what to feel. "Your father's in the ER," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He's been in a serious accident, and we don't know what's going to happen." I felt the blood drain from my face. My father. The man who had always been so strong, so reliable, the one I had always looked up to, he was in danger and I wasn't there. I had abandoned my family 5 years ago, and now, when they needed me most, I was nowhere to be found. The guilt hit me like a wave, knocking the breath out of me. I had never imagined that something like this would happen. My mind raced with questions. What had happened? Was it serious? Was he going to make it? I knew without a doubt that I had to go to him, despite everything, despite the pain, despite the years of silence. I had to be there. I owed him that much. So I packed up and drove to the hospital, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. The drive felt like it took forever, the miles stretching out in front of me, as if the universe itself was testing me, forcing me to confront the past I had run away from. When I arrived at the hospital, my mother was waiting for me in the waiting room, her face pale and drawn, eyes swollen from crying. She looked up as I approached, and for the first time in years, our eyes met without the walls of anger or betrayal between us. It was as if time had stood still, as if nothing had changed, even though everything had. "Thank you for coming," she whispered, and I could hear the relief in her voice. It was the first time I had seen her this vulnerable, this open. It was as though she had been waiting for me all this time, and now, in this moment of crisis, she was finally asking for my help. I nodded, though I didn't have the words to offer her. I didn't know how to speak to her, didn't know where to start. Everything had changed between us, and I wasn't sure if there was a way back. But none of that mattered right now. My father was the only thing that mattered. They led me to his room, where he was hooked up to machines, his body pale and still. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. He looked so small in that hospital bed, so fragile. The man who had been my rock, my source of strength, now seemed so vulnerable. It hit me harder than I expected, and I had to swallow back the lump in my throat. I stood by his side for a long while, not knowing what to say, not knowing how to handle the overwhelming emotions that were surging through me. My mind kept drifting back to the time before everything fell apart, the way he used to laugh, the way he'd teach me things, the way he had always been there for me no matter what. Now, he was lying here, fighting for his life, and I wasn't sure if he even wanted me there. I had left him, I had abandoned him, just as I had abandoned the rest of the family. Then, just as I was about to leave the room, a quiet voice from behind me broke the silence. My father stirred, his eyes slowly opening, and his gaze landed on me. For a moment, I didn't know if he even recognized me, if he even cared that I was there. But then he spoke, his voice weak but steady, and I could hear the anger and regret in his words. "You know, all these years I never thought you'd come back," he said, his eyes holding mine with a fierce intensity that sent a chill down my spine. "I thought you were gone for good, but here you are. And I'll tell you this, you didn't have to come. You didn't have to do this, but you did. And I'm not sure I'll ever forgive you for what you did, but I'm glad you're here now." His words hit me like a slap in the face, but they also hit home in a way I couldn't ignore. I had made my choices, but now I was here. And now all I had to do was accept the consequences of my actions. I had come back to my family after all these years, not because I had all the answers, but because I couldn't live with the emptiness of the past any longer. It wasn't about fixing everything or undoing the hurt. It was about showing up, being present, and accepting that life doesn't always offer second chances. But sometimes, if we're lucky, we get one more shot at redemption. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to start over.